Human Radio, episode number 94, and it is transatlantic. We are on the line with, I think this lady is in California. It's probably way sunnier than what it is in the UK, because we know what the UK is like. But we do love it. It's a beautiful place. It's our home. Well, for the people that are listening that are in the UK anyway. I have on the line, a very clever individual, far cleverer than me, so when she does talk, pay attention, because it will make far more sense than I do. Hello, Rhonda Patrick.
Hello. Thanks for having me, Ben.
Thank you. Let me turn up this volume. You are... Rhonda, for the people that have no Scooby-Doo, who Rhonda is, who is Rhonda?
Well, I'm still trying to figure that out. I'm defining myself as I go along, but... I'll let you know a little bit about my background in terms of my credentials and my scientific history. So I have a PhD in biomedical science, and I have done research ranging from aging to cancer metabolism, mitochondrial metabolism, and now I'm currently doing a postdoc where I am actively researching the role of micronutrients like vitamin and minerals and essential fatty acids and their role in preventing diseases of aging, and also their role in preventing things like cancer. So that's kind of a very short, brief introduction to who I am. And so I also, in addition to doing research, I translate some of the science behind, health and nutrition to the public, so they can sort of understand exactly, some of these mechanisms that are, coming out, through research. They can understand, what and why certain micronutrients are important and why it's important to have enough of them.
Wow. So essentially, you are someone that's in the lab, you're doing the thing, you're doing all the hard research, so when us coaches translate these weird and new interesting facts to our client to say, now, we shouldn't be doing this, we should be doing that, you're one of those people that actually found this stuff out.
Yes, indeed.
Which is cool. It's cool. Because I'll be honest, there's not a huge amount of researchers that put themselves in the public domain because, which is granted, they're in the lab doing the stuff and concentrating on that work. So it can actually be quite hard to talk to people in the trenches doing this kind of work. And also, I suppose, if you were to generalize about character types, researchers might be the ones that are happy to kind of just stay in the lab, do their thing, and then publish the paper. Whereas there's idiots like me online that are shouting their mouth, without the PhD.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. No, most of my colleagues are a little socially awkward. And, like in graduate school, I spent 6 years it took me to get my PhD. And I spent most of the time in the lab just looking at mitochondria. So not really socializing much. But I really enjoy the public aspect of it as well. I enjoy educating people, especially because there are a lot of mistakes that are made, from the point where the research is published and we have new findings to the point where it actually gets into the public eye. There's people that don't understand what the research implications mean, and they sort of translate that and misinform the public. And so that sort of irritates me. And I've taken an active role in trying to properly educate people as to what some of these scientific findings are actually saying and what they actually mean by explaining mechanism, explaining how things work. I think when people understand how things work, they're much more likely to understand what they mean.
Yeah, of course. See, I think, just the topic of research by itself is fascinating in the fitness and health world because, there's definitely arguments within the industry of, practice and research and where we join the line because, coaching for us, the people that are on the ground is an art and a science. We have to blend those two kind of ingredients. And I was listening to Chris Kresser's podcast today, who's a practitioner I like and enjoy. And he was sort of saying that, we have to remember that everything that happens within the science is just an expansion of the current thought process. Like, we currently believe a certain amount of facts, and those certain amount of facts are kind of true until we disprove them again, and then we will have a new paradigm of thinking. So some people will say the research is gospel, but the research is gospel kind of at that point in time.
Yeah, I mean, there's the research is we're always learning more and always adding on to our current body of knowledge. And, and biology is so complex, so incredibly complex. And understanding these intricate mechanisms and how the interplay between all these different, systems in our body, how they're interacting is incredibly difficult. And there's almost no way we can possibly understand how it all works at once. People are working on very specific components of each of these systems. So, I think that one of the really important things, and something that I like to do, is take a step back and look at the big picture and see how all these things work together. And sometimes we'll have conflicting data that comes out, and in some cases it's not necessarily conflicting. If you understand some of these mechanisms that are happening, then it sort of makes sense. So I'll give you an example where this context is so important. So micronutrients are, about 40 or so essential vitamins and minerals, essential fatty acids, and amino acids that we need for proper function of, different proteins in our body, enzymes, our gene function, things like that. And we get, a lot of, at least in the United States, I'm not sure exactly about the percentages in the UK, but in the United States, I know that, for example, 34% of people don't get enough vitamin A, 25% of people don't get enough vitamin C, 70% are not getting enough vitamin D, and 60% are not getting enough vitamin E. So, these are all essential vitamins, and, the majority of the population are not getting enough of them. So people will take supplemental vitamins to sort of fill in some of those gaps that they're not getting from their diet. And in some instances, taking supplemental vitamins have been shown to be bad. And so what happens is when you have these studies come out that show, for example, when you're taking folic acid, well, folic acid is actually the oxidized form of folate. And so really it's folate that we need and we require. Folate's essential to make thiamine, which is a essential nucleotide in our DNA. So if we don't get enough of folate, then what happens is we end up getting strand breaks in our DNA, which is DNA damage, which can actually lead to cancer. However, if you already have cancer and you're taking a lot of this folic acid, then what happens is, because cancer cells are rapidly proliferating and they're propagating and trying to replicate, they actually love things that give them more precursors to DNA, because they're synthesizing new DNA to make new cancer cells. So we have studies coming out showing that people that have, for example, colon cancer, taking folic acid pills, well, they accelerate their cancer. Well, that's not true in people that don't have cancer. In fact, the opposite is true. People that take folic acid that don't have cancer actually, prevent themselves from getting cancer. So here we have this context-dependent situation where people that have cancer shouldn't be taking high doses of folic acid, but if you don't have cancer, you want to make sure you're getting enough, to make sure that you're meeting your folate requirements. So context and understanding the mechanism by which, folate is an important precursor for this essential nucleotide to make DNA sheds light onto this whole topic. And it's not really that conflicting if you understand this mechanism. It's very interesting.
It is fascinating. And I suppose that's why we as coaches are always trying to say to people, well, okay, that may be true in one context, but not another. So I'll answer your question when you give me the variables, which is why, in nutritional circles, the answer is always, it depends, isn't it? It's never X or Y.
Right.
It's always an accumulation of those different.
Exactly. I'll give you another example. A publication just came out this week, actually, in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is the highest impact journal you could possibly publish in. So that means impact means how many people reference that journal. And so the higher the impact, the more difficult it is to get your research published. So you really have to have a novel finding. It has to be well done. You have to have mechanism. I mean, and for New England Journal of Medicine, in addition to that, you also have to have a clinical translation. So so it's really a very high-end journal. Mm-hmm. And there was a editorial that just came out this week discussing the detrimental effects of antioxidants. And essentially what the article stated was that supplemental antioxidants such as vitamin E and N-acetylcysteine accelerate cancer. And so it goes into this whole, talking about recent studies that came out showing this, and it totally is one-sided, doesn't give context at all. And it's really frustrating because, the take home is now people are going to read this and go, oh my God, supplemental antioxidants are going to give me cancer. I shouldn't take it. Well, let me explain this to you. So antioxidants, what they do is they bind and they sequester, reactive oxygen, reactive nitrogen species that our bodies are producing every day. Our mitochondria, which are the source of breaking down, carbohydrates, fatty acids, things that we're consuming to make energy. Well, our mitochondria are constantly producing what's called reactive oxygen species, like oxygen radicals, like superoxide. These things, in the context of causing cancer, what happens is these radicals will react with our DNA, and they will damage the DNA such that it adds like a bulky adduct to it, or it causes a strand break, something like that. And this can, over time, eventually, if this happens in a part of the genome that's important for, a very important gene for proliferation or cell cycle, or apoptosis, which is cell death, can lead to cancer because you get mutations in a gene that are really important for keeping cancer, at bay. And so, having DNA damage is not a good thing because it's a cancer initiator. It can, that can cause mutations that can lead to cancer. So having antioxidants to prevent that from happening are very, very important. However, if you already have cancer, then what happens is when you generate these like reactive oxygen species, it activates a genetic pathway that senses these reactive oxygen radicals and goes, oh, this is not good. I need to cause this cell to die. So it causes cell death. And so these are called tumor suppressor genes. And so when you already have cancer, in some cases, having a little bit of reactive oxygen species is good because it can induce these genetic pathways to cause the death of cancer cells. And so recently, this study was published earlier this year in Science Translational Medicine, where they had mice, and they had mice that had lung cancer. And they gave these mice about 10 times the RDA of alpha tocopherol, which is one of the forms of vitamin E. And what happened is, because vitamin E is a very potent sequester of oxidation products, it prevented DNA damage, it prevented damage to DNA, and prevented that whole pathway from being activated. So these cancer cells were not dying because there was no activation of this genetic pathway, which causes them to die, which is, not good if you have cancer. But in the control mice, which did not have cancer, it was great because giving these control mice these alpha tocopherol, the vitamin E, prevented strand breaks. It prevented their DNA from being damaged. It prevented this early cancer initiator. So what you have here is context dependent, where you say, okay, this mouse that already has lung cancer, giving it high doses of vitamin E is not a good thing because you know what? It's going to accelerate the cancer growth because it's not going to allow for the activation of that genetic pathway that senses oxidative products. So, in my mind, when we have studies like this that are published, instead of just making it one-sided, which is very sensational, when you have something that comes out that says, oh my God, antioxidants are not only useless, but they're bad for you. I mean, that gets a lot of media attention, really, really gets a lot of media attention. But in reality, what's going on here is that we have a context-dependent situation where taking supplemental antioxidants are very different from people that have normal cells, normal people that don't have cancer, healthy people, versus people that already have cancer. So this is something that is, I see it time and time again where, people are publishing these studies and it's controversial, but really when we look at the mechanism and we understand the context of the study, it makes perfect sense. So I'm kind of trying to shed some light on the context of some of these topics.
So talking about context and the people that are listening to this podcast, which will obviously, people will now be trying to distill the information that you're giving them, and we're talking about, certain nutrients that we might isolate within our health, because there'll be people listening that will probably be supplementing right now with vitamin E, vitamin D, vitamin C, for whatever reason. What should we be bearing in mind with some of the things that you've just said with looking at supplementation and why and how we're using these supplements?
Yeah, so vitamin E is a really, really important one to talk about, and that's because vitamin E refers to a whole family of tocopherols and trianols. And the major form found in our plasma, found in our tissues, is alpha tocopherol. So when you go out and you go to your general nutrition store or whatever to buy your vitamin supplements, typically when you buy a vitamin E supplement, what you're buying is the alpha tocopherol form. And there's something very, very important to understand about that, because alpha tocopherol, while it is the major form found in our tissues, it's a very potent antioxidant, meaning it's very good at sequestering these reactive oxygen species that I just mentioned. What it does is there's another form of tocopherol that's very important in our body, and that's called gamma tocopherol. Gamma tocopherol does something completely different than alpha tocopherol. Gamma tocopherol is very good at sequestering what's called reactive nitrogen species. So reactive nitrogen species are produced from our immune system when our immune system gets activated, whether it's during illness, sickness, bacterial infection, or if it's some sort of chronic inflammatory disease that we have. We produce, like, for example, our macrophages will make nitric oxide, and this nitric oxide will react with other oxygen species in our body to form very damaging peroxynitrite products, which also damage our DNA and damage our lipid membranes and damage our proteins in our body. So gamma tocopherol is very good at sequestering these reactive nitrogen species. And something very important to understand is that when you supplement with high doses of the alpha tocopherol form, you actually deplete your gamma tocopherol. So it's really, really not a good thing to take high doses of the vitamin E alpha tocopherol form. So the RDA of the alpha tocopherol is about 22.4 or so IUs a day. And I think if you go to a nutritional store, you'll see, like, very commonly 400 IUs. And that's like 10 times the RDA. 400 IUs of alpha tocopherol is really not good to supplement with, because you're going to deplete your gamma tocopherol levels, and you want your gamma tocopherol. So, getting your vitamin E from natural sources like, nuts, walnuts, pecans, almonds, avocados are also a good source of vitamin E. They have the mixed tocopherols. They have the alpha and the gamma. They have all these things. But if you are, if you really want to supplement with a vitamin E, I actually, from my understanding, it seems like it's a good thing to get mixed tocopherols and make sure you're not getting really, really high levels. I mean, 22 IUs is sufficient. So 22 to 30 IUs of the alpha and the gamma. I mean, you can find those sorts of vitamin supplements out there.
Nice.
So that's really a really important thing with vitamin E that I think most people don't know. And I'm actually getting ready to write. I just wrote an article on that I'm going to be publishing soon. So that information will be out there. But nice. Vitamin D. But let's talk a little bit about vitamin D, because it's really important. In the United States, about 70%.
Let me just kind of track back and sum up for people there, because I think it's really nice that you came back to a whole food example in terms of how we're getting our nutrition, because ultimately I think where we can, that's how we should be getting our vitamins and minerals. You mentioned nuts. We spoke, it came up in a question on a podcast of mine a while ago, and we spoke about the potential of, phytic acid and nutrient absorption. talking about nuts and getting vitamin E from nuts, do you have an opinion on phytic acid in nuts, and are we potentially shortchanging getting the nutrition from things like nuts and legumes?
So, the phytates are present in nuts. They're present in legumes. They're present in vegetables. I mean, they're part of the plant's phosphorus source, and so these minerals are complexed to phytic acid. Vitamin E is not complex to it, but minerals like magnesium, zinc, they are complex to phytate. And yes, our gut bacteria is not able to break down phytate, and so having phytic acid, having phytate actually reduces bioavailability of some of these minerals like magnesium and zinc. However, it's not to a point that I think that if you look at some of like oat bran, brown rice, those sources have a much higher level of phytate with respect to like nuts and plants, vegetables, for example, and it's not like a huge deal. I don't think people need to focus on, oh my God, there's phytate in these nuts and plants, so I'm not going to be able to get any of the magnesium or zinc. Well, that's not true. You do absorb it. Yes, it reduces bioavailability to some degree. The more acidic our gut bacteria is, so meaning probiotics are always associated with acidity, things that are producing lactic acid, acetic acid, things like that, help us to get some of those minerals away from the phytic acid, and so we actually can absorb them better. So it all sort of comes back to our gut health. Also, the more healthy our gut biome, the more healthy our gut is, the better we do absorb some of these minerals. But in my opinion, it's not. I think people focus on it more than they should, and I think that getting, eating your nuts and your vegetables, and some people even say cook. So heat can activate what's called phytases, which actually chew up phytate, so they can release some of these minerals from the phytate and increase the bioavailability. However, if you're cooking your vegetables, say you're boiling and we're blanching them, then what ends up happening is these ions will go into solution. So magnesium, zinc, they'll go into solution. And so you end up not getting them ultimately because now they're in the water that you blanched or boiled them. So
boil your veg, then drink the water.
Right. So I don't focus on it as much, okay. But it can reduce bioavailability.
That's the conclusion that I came to as well, in terms of it's not to the extent that we should be worried about it, as in that we should be soaking all our nuts. But there, like you said, there's high amounts in grains, and if we're looking at nutrient density, then we shouldn't really be trying to get our magnesium, etc., from grains, because the amount that we're going to get compared to some other foods is just going to be inferior.
Absolutely. Magnesium is actually at the center of a chlorophyll molecule. So you can think about, magnesium being at the center of chlorophyll molecule. A chlorophyll molecule is what give plants their green pigment. So I personally think that getting your magnesium from dark green leafy vegetables is ideal. Even though there is a very high magnesium content in some of these grains, like in oats, because of the very high phytate content, I think that getting it from plants is actually ideal. Plus, you're getting all the other important micronutrients: vitamin K, vitamin calcium, vitamin C. They're all in those dark green leafy vegetables.
Oh, totally. Talking of magnesium, do you think it's something? I mean, the research indicates this, but something that a lot of people are hugely lacking, because something that I started to play around with a long time ago, and in the fitness and the bodybuilding world, we've been using ZMA for years, but actually looking at using transdermal magnesium and how effective that can be at repleting stores, especially in people that exercise.
Yeah. So something interesting about magnesium is that in the United States, about 45% of people don't meet their magnesium requirements, and magnesium is actually an essential cofactor for DNA repair enzymes in our body, many different DNA repair enzymes in our body. And what that means is that, when we have damage to our DNA from just normal metabolism, from our immune system, these things that I mentioned, reactive oxygen species, reactive nitrogen species, these things, every single, hour of every single day, this is being generated and it's damaging our DNA. And our DNA repair enzymes are working really hard to repair that damage so that it doesn't cause a mutation. And this is going on right now as we speak, literally. And in order for those DNA repair enzymes to work properly, they require magnesium. When I say a cofactor, what I mean is that it's a lot of minerals are cofactors for different enzymes and proteins in our body. And what that means is that, that enzyme needs it to actually have optimal function, to do what it's supposed to do. And so having magnesium the right amount of magnesium is so important, not only for, the athletic performance and, things like that, but long-term literally for preventing cancer. So, because DNA damage, does lead to mutations, and as we age, 10, 20 years down the line, we start to get these random, every time we get a random mutation in a certain part of our genome, eventually we're going to get it in the right spot. And that's why it usually takes a few decades to happen, why cancer is one of those diseases of aging. But having enough magnesium to make sure you can repair damage so that it doesn't cause a mutation, because once you get a mutation, there's no turning back. You get a mutation in a certain gene, that cell, then when it replicates to produce more cells to replace it, it's always going to have that mutation, and you can't go back, and turn it back to normal. So preventing the DNA damage from causing a mutation at that point is so important, and that's where DNA repair enzymes come into play. And so, getting magnesium, like I said, getting it from greens is really, really, really important. But, I've done a little bit of reading on the transdermal magnesium, and it does appear that we can transdermally absorb magnesium and does get taken up into the bloodstream. I haven't done extensive research on that topic, so I don't know, to what extent taking transdermal magnesium can replete your magnesium. But I do know, talking to athletes, they seem to say that it affects their muscle soreness. And
Sure.
helps them recover.
Well, that's the reason why I asked, because it's an area of interest of mine, because I started playing around with it a long time ago, and through the benefits that I saw, I ended up advancing that kind of theory and developed a product a while ago, which is Transdermal, which contains magnesium, zinc, arginine, niacin, and trace elements. And it works on the exact premise that you just mentioned with the athletes, that you're trying to increase the rate of recovery. And we find that people, their feeling or the soreness that they get after training is hugely reduced, and their rate of recovery is vastly increased. And that's why I was just trying to connect the dots from my own geekism, and obviously looking at what I've kind of developed with your thought process, really.
Right. Yeah. No, transdermal magnesium absorption absolutely occurs. So, that makes perfect sense. And if you think about one of the reasons why magnesium is so important for wound healing is because it also, your mitochondria are essential to generate ATP. When you have a high physical demand, you need energy, right? So you need energy to recover. You need ATP to help recover from a lot of the stress that you've put on your body. And so your mitochondria are really important in that respect, and magnesium are really important for ATP production. So it's, complex to DNA. It's also very important to repair your mitochondria as they've been damaged. These DNA repair enzymes that I was referring to earlier, your mitochondria also has its own genome and its own DNA, and they also get damaged, particularly when you're exercising, because when you're exercising, you're putting so much stress on your body. You have this huge oxidative burst because because that oxidative burst ends up damaging your mitochondrial DNA. You need to repair that damage so that your mitochondria can continue to work efficiently, and magnesium helps that happen. So ultimately, magnesium is very important to make ATP, which is very important for wound healing and recovery. So that all makes perfect sense that taking magnesium, particularly for athletes, and actually athletes end up, because magnesium does get excreted, that magnesium requirements for athletes is actually a little bit higher than the normal population.
Yeah, and because we're going to deplete it so quickly because of our training. It's not like we can't be classed as the normal population because of some of the extensive training that we do.
Right, exactly.
So really, our RDA, we could hypothesize that it might be way higher.
Yeah, in some instances, it depends on your degree of physical activity. I think I've seen studies indicating it ranges anywhere between 10 and 20% higher. The athletes, and like if you're one of those endurance athletes, that your requirements are like up in the 20% range higher than what the normal RDA is. That's kind of what I've
read too. Well, if you wanted to play around with it more, by all means, give me your address and I'll send you some, and you can just use it as an N=1 personal thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always game for doing some self-experimentation, so that'd be cool.
We all. So vitamin D. I know it's a huge topic that you enjoy talking about. You sent me an infographic, which was very cool. I'll make sure I post it as part of the podcast so people can see it. But I suppose when you emailed me and you sort of said, Ben, I'd quite like to discuss a few topics. Vitamin D was at the top of your list. Is this for a reason? Do you find that it's one of these nutrients that almost contains a huge amount of power within the human body?
Yes, absolutely. So vitamin D actually gets converted into a steroid hormone. And what that means is that so vitamin D, steroid hormones regulate the expression of genes in our body, and vitamin D regulates the expression of over 1,000 different genes in our body. So we have genes that have this little sequence in them that is a telltale sequence that vitamin D, when the active vitamin D hormone binds to the vitamin D receptor, this receptor then translocates into the nucleus where our DNA is, binds to this certain region of our DNA, and it'll either turn a gene on, and when the gene's turned on, it's active, it's doing what it's supposed to do, or it'll turn a gene off, so that even though the gene is there, it's silenced. It's almost as if it isn't there. And this is a very, very important mechanism for regulating gene expression. And vitamin D is regulating, like I said, over 1,000 different genes. And that's literally almost 1/24 of the human genome that vitamin D is regulating the expression of, which is, quite striking. Mm. And, in the United States, what we know is that, 70% of people are not getting enough vitamin D. And there's several reasons for that. One, vitamin D is so important that we can actually make it from being out in the sun. So UVB radiation is required to penetrate through our epidermis, and it converts something called 7-dehydrocholesterol, which is in our skin, converts it into vitamin D3. And vitamin D3 then can be released into the bloodstream, goes into the liver, gets converted into 25-hydroxy vitamin D, which is the major circulating stable form of vitamin D, and that's actually what most people get measured when they have their vitamin D levels measured. But that's not the active hormone. So 25-hydroxy vitamin D then goes and gets converted into 1,25-hydroxy vitamin D in the kidneys, and that's the actual steroid hormone. And once you have the steroid hormone, it goes to many different tissues and regulates many different processes. And so because UVB radiation is required to make that vitamin D in the skin, things like melanin, which is a natural sunscreen to protect people from, burning in the tropic regions, it actually inhibits the synthesis of vitamin D in the skin, the same as sunscreen. Sunscreen also does. And so, many people that have melanin, a dark melanin content are basically are not getting enough vitamin D if they're living, in a region that is very northern from the equator. So another thing that's really important is like I said, UVB. Well, at certain times of the year, depending on where you live, UVB isn't even hitting the atmosphere. So, things like living at a very northern latitude relative to the equator affect that. And I know that UK is one of those regions that like 6 months out of the year, I think it's really almost impossible to make vitamin D from the sun.
Yeah, because I heard it was not until around, I think it was like late April, that the sun gets high enough in our environment that we will actually convert vitamin D.
Yep, exactly. Late April. That's late April to September, something like that.
Yeah.
But so that's something that's really a reason why there's the vitamin D deficiency is so prevalent, and So it's very, very important to understand that, if you're not out in the sun, if you don't live in a region where, you're getting this UVB radiation throughout the year and you're not, getting enough of the sun. Like personally, I wear sunscreen because I'm always concerned about skin aging, skin cancer, things like that. So I get my vitamin D from a supplement. I take a supplement, and most people don't do that. At least that's what the statistics are telling us. 70% of the U.S. population is not getting an adequate level of vitamin D. And what's defined as an adequate level is always a little difficult. The Endocrinology Institute in the United States basically thinks that levels of 25-hydroxy vitamin D below 30 nanograms per mil is not sufficient. And that's based on just how much vitamin D you need to maintain bone homeostasis. But like I said, you have over 1,000 different genes that vitamin D is regulating. And so we're talking about brain function, immune function. We're talking about a lot of different processes that vitamin D is regulating, DNA damage, DNA repair enzymes. These things, we don't even know how much we need, to regulate these processes. That sort of still needs to be defined. But we do know that not having levels above 30 nanograms per mil is definitely not going to get us there.
So really, with the modern lifestyle that we live, in terms of most people, even in the summer, get in their car, drive to work, stand in a building, get in their car, drive home again, never really see the sun, we could warrant that a huge amount of people should be supplemented with vitamin D 365 days of the year?
Yeah, I think, I do personally. And, the fact that people aren't out in the sun, they're at their computers, they're in their cubicle, or if you're me, you're in the lab, so I think that it's a good idea, first and foremost, to get your vitamin D levels tested, because then you can sort of gauge how much you need to supplement with. And if we look at epidemiological studies, multiple meta-analyses, meaning that there have been studies published where they've looked at many different studies that have looked at, for example, all-cause mortality, which is probably the most long-term effect endpoint you can define. People that have levels of vitamin D between 40 and 60 nanograms per milliliter seem to be have the lowest all-cause mortality. So people that have lower than that have an increased all-cause mortality, and people that have really high levels of vitamin D also have an increased all-cause mortality. And when we look at mechanistically, when we turn to mouse studies, we can speculate the reason for that is because too much vitamin D, what ends up happening is when you have vitamin D, you increase your absorption of calcium. So if you have really, really high levels of vitamin D, you're able to absorb calcium much more efficiently. However, if you keep absorbing a lot of calcium, what ends up happening is you can get calcification of your arteries, and that can lead to cardiovascular diseases. It can also lead to vascular diseases in the brain. So things like, too much vitamin D can cause hypercalcemia, and that's been proposed as one of the mechanisms by which too much vitamin D can be unhealthy. And in fact, if we look in mouse models, when they knock out vitamin D receptor, and so the mouse can't get any vitamin D at all, it's a progeria aging phenotype. These mice rapidly age. I mean, rapidly. It's unbelievable. All the tissues in their body just start deteriorating and they die earlier. However, if you knock out a gene that is a negative regulator of vitamin D, meaning now the mouse has way too much vitamin D, it also is a progeria aging phenotype, and that has been shown to be due to the high levels of calcium. So one thing to keep in mind is that, vitamin K, one of the forms of vitamin K is an important cofactor for a protein called matrix GLA protein, which is essential for preventing calcification buildup in the arteries. So, you want to have a balance of these micronutrients, and you want to make sure you're not getting too much of one, because these things are all interacting. So I think it's really important. You don't want to just go out and just take massive doses of all these vitamins, because that's not good.
So with our kind of discussion in mind, and saying to people, right, well, I think vitamin D is something that everyone should be supplementing with on a daily regime. with all those things beared in mind, low doses, high doses, potential issues with vitamin D, what would you say is a safe amount to take as a daily supplement regime?
With vitamin D, it's really tricky to come up with a sort of one dose fits all. And that's because, like I said, depending on your sun exposure, also vitamin D is fat soluble. So depending on the amount of body fat you have, it gets stored in your body fat. And they've shown that the more body fat you have, the less bioavailable vitamin D is to be released into the bloodstream, where it gets converted into the active steroid hormone.
Wow.
So that also is a factor. Personally, I supplement with 4,000 IUs a day, and I don't get a lot of sun exposure. So, and also I have a pretty, low body percent. And I recently got my levels. I test my levels, probably like every quarter. And my most recent test showed that my levels of 25 hydroxy vitamin D were 50 nanograms per milliliter. And so, I supplement with 4,000 IUs a day. And, I've been doing that for years now.
So we could almost make a bit of a blanket statement for people that are fairly lean. So
we can.
With you,
yeah.
with what you said in mind about people that are overweight, how does the ball game change? You're kind of saying that if we are supplementing with high doses, that will get stored in the fat tissue and thus could potentially be toxic.
Right. Well, so with people, I think a good sort of just crude guesstimate as to how much to supplement with would be 1,000 IUs of vitamin D per 25 pounds of body weight. However, this maxes out at about 5,000 IU. So right. If you're, extremely, overweight and you weigh, a lot, you don't take 25,000 IUs of vitamin D. You max out about 5,000 IU. And really what you need to do is you need to get your levels tested. I know in the United States, it's, covered by health insurance. It's cheap. It's an easy test. It's just so easy. There's just no reason not to do it. There's also tests you can buy online that are relatively accurate that you can do at home and send it in, and they'll tell you your levels. You'll have some degree of error, but you at least get a ballpark for what your levels are. And I really, really encourage that because, like I said, you don't want too much vitamin D. So, some people will hear this podcast and go, wow, vitamin D is so important. It's important for, I just published a paper showing that it regulates serotonin production in your brain, and serotonin production in your brain is very important for regulating a variety of cognitive processes, executive function. It's important for mood, behavior, pro-social behavior. I mean, it does so many things. In the developing brain, it's actually a brain morphogen. Serotonin actually shapes the structure of the brain because it guides neurons to migrate to their proper place and to differentiate into the proper neuronal cell type. So it's so important. And vitamin D is regulating that, So, even though vitamin D is very important, you don't want too much of it. And I can't emphasize that enough.
Wow.
And like I said, from what I've seen, there's been a couple of studies that have come out saying, levels higher than 34 nanograms per mil are associated with a higher all-cause mortality. However, from my massive, massive scouring of the literature, by and large, more meta-analyses have shown that actually between 40 and 60 nanograms per mil is the sweet spot in terms of lower all-cause mortality. And like I said, when we turn to the mechanism and we look at mouse models, that makes sense. So, wow. Yeah, I think that's sort of my take on it.
Nice. Okay. Well, and I think that's given some people really interesting information for people to take away, because we've talked about vitamin D in the past, and it's definitely research that's constantly evolving. We're always getting a greater understanding of it, and it's definitely a nutrient that we are, heavily focused on. The research is becoming abundant purely because we know how powerful it is, and you've just kind of reiterated people's thoughts really, and hopefully people will consider looking at their vitamin D and definitely getting supplementation as a result. If people do want to get their vitamin D tested, then it's something that we can do via our lab for you. If you go to bodytypenutrition.co.uk onto the lab page, you can order it through there with our functional medicine practitioner, Alex Manos. I think, don't quote me, I think it's about £30. Is it about similar in the US?
30 pounds. What's the conversion?
It's probably about $45-50.
Yeah. That sounds about right. Yep, yeah. About $45. That sounds about right. It's worth it, really. Let me just tell you, like, there's vitamin D also is very important for those DNA repair enzymes. It's really important for that, and they've shown that. So DNA repair, if you have DNA damage, for example, you can have it at your telomere. Your telomere are caps on the end of your DNA that protect your DNA from damage, from degradation, and they're a biological marker for aging. So as we're younger, our telomeres are longer, and as we age, our telomeres get shorter and shorter. And that's, because of multiple reasons. One is because as our cells divide and replicate, the telomere has a structural defect that doesn't allow for the very end of it to get replicated. So each year, we lose about 12 nucleotides per year on our telomere end. But things can actually accelerate that even further. Things like stress, damage to your DNA, can accelerate the shortening of those telomeres. And so, and vitamin D has been shown if we look at just the epidemiological studies, for example, twins, identical twins that have, when you measure their vitamin D levels, those twins with the highest levels of vitamin D had the longest telomeres. And actually, even though if you compare the biological age based on what their telomere length is, those twins, even though they're the same chronological age, those twins with the highest versus lowest vitamin D had a difference of 5 years of biological aging. So the shorter the telomeres, it was like their cells looked 5 years older, even though they're the same age. So, and then in mouse models, when we look at the mechanism for that, we've seen that when vitamin D does regulate telomere length because it's important for DNA repair. It's also important to prevent inflammation. Inflammation also causes damage to DNA at the telomere. So, it's really important for aging. It's also very important to prevent cancer. Many studies have shown. So vitamin D also regulates genes that stop proliferation of cancer cells and cause apoptosis of cancer cells. So it's actually a very important what's called anti-angiogenic factor as well. So it prevents cancer metastases. There's been multiple studies. If we look at meta-analysis, we've seen that vitamin D supplementation of like 1,500 IU a day can result in like a 17% reduction in total cancer incidence, a 29% reduction in total cancer mortality, 43% decrease in cancer of the digestive system. It's also been shown multiple times to prevent, actually it's been associated with reduction in breast cancer incidence. So, very important. I can't emphasize enough getting your levels tested. I'm really happy to hear that you guys provide that service. That's great. And it's 30 pounds is well worth it. I mean, it's not that much money, and your health, it's worth it. So I can't recommend that enough.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, we did that purely because there was testing that we had to do as a group of coaches, and we realised that without those tests, we couldn't, do our jobs properly, and that's really why the lab sort of came about. So Rhonda, thank you so much for being on today's show. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you very much.
You've dropped some serious knowledge, and I think it's given people a lot to think about, especially coaches that are listening to this and people that are, trying to optimize their health. I know there's a lot of geeks that listen to this that every week are trying to chip away at getting to optimal health, and this is just another part of the puzzle. So if people want to find you, I know that you are a great blogger, you put out some great work. Where do people find you if they'd like to?
I have a website called foundmyfitness.com, and that's where it's my platform to basically talk about all these, the science behind health and nutrition. I make videos. On Twitter, Found My Fitness is my Twitter handle. Facebook, I have a Facebook fan page where I also post studies. Again, Found My Fitness. So basically, if you go on my website, foundmyfitness.com, you can find all the places where you can find me. And I really look forward to interacting with you all.
Yeah, awesome. Right, everyone, go over to Rhonda's website and have a look. Foundmyfitness.com. It sounds like a fantastic resource. I've been over there. I've had a look. It is, it's full of information. It's worth checking out. If you've enjoyed the show, please share it on Facebook. Share it with your friends. As you know, we've recently launched on the Stitcher program as well. If you do listen to it on Stitcher, then please leave us a review. We've got hundreds and hundreds of reviews on iTunes, but it would be amazing if some of those translated its way over to Stitcher. And then maybe, you never know, we might get to #1 on Stitcher as well. And that would be awesome. So I will be back on with you next Thursday with Rachel. Next week, we'll be talking about a huge metabolic damage case study and talking about calories and a personal story about IBS and some of the different factors that feed into your IBS. And it's a very personal story, and it's a very action-packed show again. So that's thank you from me. Rhonda, thank you very much again.
Thank you, Ben.
Until next time, kids, ciao. Hey everyone, Ben Cooper Radio, episode number 93. We're both very joyous, sat here in onesies. If you're listening to this on iTunes, you won't be able to see the fact that we're both in onesies, which is a shame. Maybe hop on over to YouTube and check out our onesies.